I'm not here to make friends.
Who are you?
Are we sisters?
I pushed them away.
Are you Eden?
I am here to save Silverpine.
Don't trust her.
I'm looking
She's
for
a
something.
necromancer.
Silverpine has a lot more
No
secrets
one
than
is
we
dying
know
on my
of.
watch.
I don't ask about your common
Doesn't affect me.
Stay out of
This
my
is
life.
definitely cursed.
You don't have time for
If
this.
you don't trust me,
Is
kill me
anyone
now.
else having
Keep
visions?
having
Let's make this quick.
weird dreams.
What's in it for us?
You can join us. For now. Welcome to the Storyteller's Nook. You are walking down a city street. You went around a corner to an alleyway and you see a small wooden building that is erupting with lights, sound, and laughter. A small rickety sign is laying against the wall next to the door, and scribbled on it in blue lettering is the name, The Storyteller's Nook. You've been looking for this place for the past week, asking friends, looking in the newspaper, only just hearing about it in whispers. It is an enigma. Only those who have been there seem to know of its existence. You've heard about it from this friend and are excited to find somewhere new to hang out with like-minded people. You can't quite tell whether it's a bar or a club. You walk through its rickety front door that is stained with paint, and you are taken aback by the elegance that is presented in front of you. You are surrounded by deep, rich, wooded tones, as what seems to be a lounge of wooden tables surrounded by velvet cushioned chairs. There are many people here, either having a drink talking or, strangely enough, reading books. Not reading books individually though, but huddled together reading. You see a gentleman at the bar that has some drinks behind him, but the bar is mostly composed of different novels, tales, and short stories. The beauty of it takes you by surprise with all the different bindings of leather and gold. It makes quite the scene looking at this book bar with all his stories surrounding him as he motions for you to come closer. He pours you a nice iced tea and smiles and asks if it's your first time here. You nod, and he smiles and introduces himself as Osiris, the owner of the Storyteller's Nook. He explains the rules of a Storyteller's Nook. The first couple of times he recommends being a spectator. He motions to a table off in the corner. The table itself has 4 people seated around it, all staring passionately at a very formal black book with gold binding and a gold symbol of 3 triangles placed over each other. There are 3 words on the cover of this book, and it reads, The Dark Pillar. Chairs have been set up surrounding the table from a distance, creating an audience of sorts. You take your seat in the back, and before your very eyes, you are no longer here, but there, in the world of Kano. And that's Kano with a K. This world is young, dangerously young. It has barely been around for 500 years. No one has found its reasons for existence even though they've searched, but one thing that all the inhabitants seem to know of its gods that seem to govern its destiny for whatever goal this world seeks to accomplish. A glaring problem has revealed itself though. There's a tipping in the scales of the gods. When the beings first formed this universe, whatever beings they were, they set in order a war that would last the duration of its existence. They created this world with 10 gods of light and 10 gods of darkness, knowing that only one side will be able to exist in the end. During these first 500 years, a treaty of secrecy was formed among the dark gods, as when they met the light gods in battle, face to face, they would lose. But with this treaty, they would be able to gather together enough power to be able to pick off the gods one by one. They would snuff out the light in this world, and after the gods of light were forgotten, they themselves will battle over control of this world. their win was inevitable. We pick up our current story when there are only 3 remaining gods of righteousness left. There are Eldaf, the goddess of nature, Baranor Truesilver, the dwarven goddess of safety and home, and Torm, the god of self-sacrifice. The gods that dwell in the dark were Osmodius, Bane, Thorsdawn, Shar, Lolith, Set, Umberlee, Gramesh, Cyric, and a demon lord known as the Demogorgon. Each of the dark gods threatened to claim a portion of this land for themselves, some heading to the north, some heading to the east, some heading to the south, some heading to the west. Their chaos knew no bounds. The reason that this matters to the mortal inhabitants of his world is due to the imbalance of the god. Life had become a hollow, shambling existence. Wars raged, disease ravaged, famine spread, and death followed everywhere. Tragedy is an all too common occurrence in every living being's life in this world. There are no heroes, merely those lucky enough to survive to tell the tale. Love, peace, safety, and happiness, everything you take for granted, is simply a luxury too expensive in this cruel world. You seek not to destroy the darkness, but to survive and find a place in it, for it is inevitable. Only the blind seek out the help of the gods of light, for this world has already been left in its own shadow of darkness. We focus on one naive city whose chief export is Arcana prowess. They, somehow against all the odds, have held out against their own shadows and became known to the people around the world as a beacon. The name of that city is Silverpine. It is here that our story begins. We travel north through the wastelands, battlefields, and small towns that compose of the forgotten Serpent Sands. We travel over smaller cities such as Drake Garden, Melon, and Ashworth. We continue further over vast forests, following a winding path until we come upon silver gates that seem to go on for miles in either direction. You see the crest of Silverpine, a simple pine tree as the background with a crescent moon in front of it. The gates open, and we're now flying over the kingdom of Silverpine. As far as you can see, pine trees line the forest floor that gave the kingdom its name. You do not have time to admire its beauty or uniformity before you're swept past and we continue deeper into Silverpine. You see a bubbling swamp full of wildlife as you follow its wooden path through it. You now see an open plain that looks like the perfect spot to watch the sun rise and set. And from this vantage point, you catch a glimpse of the beauty that is hidden within this city. You see banners and lights emanating from the kingdom walls, and as your gaze pans to the left on a distant hilltop, you see the Silverpine University, where the brightest minds contemplate the secrets of the magical forces. In the distance, it seems as if fireworks are going off in this beautiful magical array, but there is no event happening. This is a nightly ritual that at sunset, every magical apprentice goes out and displays the progress that they made during the day. Fire, ice, all kinds of arcana secrets are swept out into the night. And even though the distance is great, you think that you feel the heat and power from their spells from where you stand. And as your eyes lower over the landscape, you see the fertile plainlands where the trees seem to dance and mingle at night. Your eyes must deceive you, though. You are startled by the sounds of cannons being shot right outside of the guard's keep, which is firmly planted within the Moongrave Pass. This mountain range separates Silver Pine University from the rest of the Silver Pine Kingdom and acts as sort of a barracks of all the Silver Pine militia. 7 shots of the cannon. A new company of soldiers have passed graduation. There will be much celebration tonight. Next, the observatory catches your eye with its spinning contraptions and compasses, all seeking for more knowledge. It's a sight to behold, as it sits right next to the mighty Rio River that cuts the Silver Pine Kingdom in half. Last but not least, right over this powerful roaring Rio River that has majestically carved its path through this landscape, you see a small wooden bridge with a house attached to it. It's been newly erected and its craftsmanship is beautiful. Your mind is flooded with thoughts and questions as all of Silver Pine seems to be a beautiful painting in the night. But this beauty wouldn't be here to stay. As you feel yourself being pulled back, not from your physical place, but as all of Silver Pine seems to change suddenly. The whole landscape before you changes into death and destruction, and you see corruption all over the trees as they're dying. But then you go back to the beautiful painting and you feel like it's an illusion. We are now in Silver Pine, but at a much earlier date than when our story begins. The universe is still fresh, still naive, still unsure of its path. An ethereal hooded figure walks by you. Its silence seems unnatural. It makes their way down the path to their secret meeting point. They walk calmly, yet purposefully. They are on their own mission. They're on their way to meet with the goddess known as Eldaf. They pause as they travel to enjoy the scenery, and a single thought enters their mind as they look over all of Silver Pine. Not just a single thought, but a single word. Mine. Your physical place is changed again, and this time you're flashed to a gathering place that has been constructed out of stone, a long stone table with 2 identically carved chairs. You feel like you're in the north now because you get a brisk chill as the wind passes through you. You go back to looking at this weirdly constructed meeting point that seems to, now that you've looked at it, it hasn't been placed here, but it seems the earth itself has pushed up this table and these chairs. And you look at the table, and on the north side of the table it is adorned with vines and beautiful flora. And on the south side of the table it is barren. You see it glistening, sheathed by obsidian aura. You recognize the hooded figure, the one that walked by you, and he walks through and sits and stares. And he has company, as sitting across from him on the northern side is Eldaf, the goddess of nature, beautifully adorned with all sorts of flora. And you look back at the hooded figure, and you see a single arm move to place itself onto the table. But it scares you because no hands emerge from its cloak, only twisted chains that compose themselves of long extremities, and they're twisting together to form fingers and a hand in its entirety. The goddess speaks. Are you sure there's nothing else that we can come to an agreement on? The hooded figure shakes their head no. But she continues. I would hate to plunge these beautiful lands into conflict that has no apparent resolution. And she sits and stares at the hooded figure, and he makes no movement. And she sighs and says, but if it must be done, let it be. And your breath is taken away as those last words were spoken. As it happens, Eldaf, the goddess of nature, disappears into 1,000 doves, beautifully silhouetted across the night sky. The hooded figure, in its less graceful way, shatters its form into ravens. And you see the two flocks fly away from each other. The doves flying high into the night. The ravens flying low over Silverpine to the south. And with this last event, this will be the last time that Silverpine knew true peace. A conflict has begun in Silverpine. A conflict with the gods on whose right it is to rule these lands. Eldaf, the goddess of nature, claims these lands, but so does Thorisdan, the chain god. We flash forward again. And as the years pass, you are no longer in Silverpine, but you see the world in its entirety slowly dying, being devoured by these dark gods who are slowly picking off the gods of righteousness one by one. Thorisdan, this dark god, would send all sorts of unnamed beasts and ravenous monsters upon the kingdom, and Eldaf would use her powers to bestow magical secrets to every citizen of Silverpine. This once peaceful city learned to defend itself. And as all of Silverpine took up arms against this dark god, there were 5 prominent figures that became known simply as the Council. Their power became known all across the continent, and they led Silverpine to war against the dark forces that surrounded them now. 2 truths became evident in this time. Thorisdan would not stop until he had Silverpine in his grasp, or he had been eradicated from this plane of existence. You are now standing in a dim room lit only by candles. You're standing in the shadows as 5 figures around a wooden table are standing there, barely outside of their own shadows, and they're speaking in heated tones over a map of Silverpine. A middle-aged woman steps forward. Her robes are crowded with different runes and arcanic symbols. She has a calm demeanor about her. The stress of the past years have seemed to weigh on her, becoming a weight on her shoulders that in her youth she couldn't have dreamt to have to bear. Her name is Ira, and she is the leader of the council. Tempers begin to rise now over these heated tones, and she calmly speaks, saying, I've received the news from our scouts. Our allies in the Rainhaven district have fallen, as has our Elven alliance near Drake Garden. We're running out of time, for darkness seems to snap its jaws at every step we take. Its power only grows as ours weakens. We must align ourselves for one last plan. Another human man steps forward, wearing golden necklaces and a garb of a high priest, very silk and fashionable. He seems angry and tired. His name is Horace, and his benevolent demeanor has long since faded. He stammers as he speaks. Ira, if we can speak with it, maybe a deal can be made. He's interrupted immediately by a giant fist being slammed on the table by a huge, menacing half-orc woman. What little light in this room seems to shimmer on her battered, scarred armor, covering many scars that seem to enwrap her body entirely. As she leans forward, she's bending down, looking Horace straight in his eyes. Her name is Puck. Her eyes burn with a ferocity for battle, and the darkness hasn't waned her determination yet, and she claims it would never. In her right hand, she haphazardly wields a great axe that seems to have many orcish numbers inscribed upon it. She growls at Horace. A deal would mean surrender. A truce means that we would be willing to live with those abominations and do nothing about it. We would stand idly by as those things contort our sense of righteousness and justice. And as she finishes that, you hear a small tune is being played as some strings are plucked. Calm down, Puck. He is not our enemy. He's merely suggesting what he thinks best for Silverpine. The dark elf is seen playing his lute, casually tuning it, but somehow creating a beautiful composition from it. His leather armor, composed of many dyes, complements his light lavender skin and adds depth to his white, fluffy hair. He is very handsome and gives off a charming presence. He has very big, round eyes as he looks up at Puck and puts a hand on her shoulder. His name is Afton. The silence is interrupted again by Horace, who stutters. We must do something, as Iris said. You hear another voice. A calmer voice. If I might propose a plan. A tall, slender figure sets a thick, dust-stained book down on the table, and you see his smile. He's a very quiet elven man wearing simple robes that cover the vast majority of his body. He's wearing a hood, but you can still see his gentle features under the shadow. His magical aura is powerful enough to stun even some of the gods themselves, the ones that are still living. His name is Eden. When he speaks, he is articulate and polite, and he says, "We have never tried the very simple plan of fighting." And you see the room kind of look at him, confused. Not as our individuals or within our own groups, but together as one. I'm sure the five of us together would be more than a match for Thoris Dawn. Ira and I may be able to formulate a device that should be able to hold him in a weakened state if we're able to get him that weak. And you see, there's no more argument between the five of them, but more of additions being added to this plan. The details being hammered out, and you are no longer in this room as you zoom outside the window. Its dimness, though, seems to lighten as a glimmer of hope is sparked between these five individuals. In the following months, many precise battles were won for Silverpine. They were won by a force never seen. This force consisted of the 5 council members, and in their desperation for victory had molded together as a perfect team. Whenever the citizens saw these 5 together, their entire core was reinforced by the thought that maybe there is a light at the end of this tunnel for Silverpine. And the 5 themselves would see the people rally around them and call them a new name. They were no longer the Council, but they will be known as the Archmages of Silverpine. Ira and Eden would go on to finish a magical device that was able to separate and capture any deity after it's been in a weakened state. And it would take this deity and separate it into 5 separate amulets encrusted with arcanic ruins. And after much planning, the time had finally come for what they thought would be the last battle for Silverpine. But as they hurried to get to the meeting place, they arrived too late to stop Thoriston's initial summoning. The Archmages and their apprentices would see a 50-foot portal being forcefully ripped and torn open by 2 long black arms. And as it ripped open this fabric of reality, a warped, distorted figure would crawl its way out of the void, followed by warped obsidian chains that seem to tie its body back to this void. And as Thoriston rips each of these chains from its body, the Archmages prepare for their final push. The 9 individuals that would witness a nightmare of a shadow that seemed to be composed of screaming souls as it rose from this void, chains still wrapped around its neck, wrists, and torso. It would let out a harrowing scream of glee as the flames inside its eyes would dance with joy. It finally realized that its prey that it had been chasing for months was close. You're now there, and you see these 5 Archmages ready themselves for battle. They had steadied themselves in their solitude and resolutions, and they were going to let their power declare their message to Thoriston. You see in the back the dark elf known as Afton, Archmage Afton, as he's known now, take out a small device from his backpack and wrap it around his neck, and you see him attach his flute to it. And at the same time, he would take out his lute and he would start playing both in a beautiful composition. And it's one of the most beautiful things that you've ever heard. But you all also notice this light green roll off of these instruments and go to form auras around each of them, each of the Archmages. He is preparing for one of his final battles. And then you see Ira taking a crystal torch. Well, it seems like you can only describe it as a long staff. At the very end of it, a flame is burning made of crystalline substances. And you'll see her speak a few words, and then she'll take a look back at the rest of the Archmages. And around this distorted figure, you will see more portals being formed, this time of light. And pouring out of these portals, you will see creatures of all sorts, composed entirely of this light crystal substance. You recognize some as boars, some as tigers. There seems to be some large griffins in the mix as well, but hundreds of these things will pour out of the portal and start attacking Thoriston. And without missing a beat, Horus, Archmage Horus, would take a long, what seems to be a sword, but instead of having a blade, it's just composed of a cross. And you'll see him put both hands and bring it over his chest. And he will start speaking what seem to be prayers of hope and light. And shields, shimmering shields, will start forming over everyone, all 9 individuals. And he will ready another spell, holding on to it and looking over at who is now his good companion, Eden, Archmage Eden, the wizard. As Eden will take a small ring on his hand and slowly bring it up to his mouth and start speaking words into it. And as that happens, you will see huge rays of energy crackling off this ring. And the rays would go up into the sky and then drop back down onto Eden. And you'll see him harnessing all this power and forming a huge ethereal form. And it seems to be a giant armored knight that's forming, and you'll see it charging towards Thor's Dawn as these other creatures that Ira the Summoner has brought down upon him. You'll see the last Archmage, Puck, the mighty orc woman, the warrior. Funnily enough, she hated the name the Archmages, for she wields no magic, no tricks or gimmicks, as she calls them, but only her great axe and the courage to keep going on. You'll see Puck running straight for Thor's Dawn, weapon raised, weapon raised. And you'll see her charging at this giant shadowy form. And you will witness this battle of crackling energy and just destruction being happened. And it will last for days. And as you watch these beings on either side, Thor's Dawn and the Archmages would give up everything in this battle. Every trick, every spell, every maneuver, every technique, every fiber of their body, they would be battling for these 4.5 days. You'll slowly see Thor's Dawn start slowing down. But scarily enough, you'll see the Archmages slowing down as well. Eden's magic no longer has that same power to it, that same aura. Horus seemed just now to be not doing any more maneuvers or prayers, but just casting straight spells. Afton would still be playing his tunes that buff the whole Archmages, but he didn't have that flair about him. Ira, even in her weakened state, and her being the eldest of the Archmages, the leader, would know that she couldn't show any weakness. So she would stand her ground and not show any sign of stopping as she continued to pour on these crystal creatures of light onto Thor's Dawn. And you'll see Puck, flashes of Puck actually grappling Thor's Dawn. You didn't even think that was possible. He just seems like a shadow. But she has found a way to have physical battle with Thor's Dawn, as her compatriots are supporting her. And then you'll pan out, and you'll see 4 more individuals standing about 500 to 1,000 feet away. And they seem to be standing there and just watching this awe-inspiring battle. They do have their weapons ready though, but they make no move to join the Archmages. These were the 4 apprentices of the Archmages. They were known to the people as the Fathom Four. Consisting of the Fathom Four, Archmage Eden had chosen a young man who was a soldier in the militia and shown him great potential as one of his mages. This man's name was Showa, and he wore golden armor with the crest of a lion on the breastplate, and he wielded a simple short sword and shield. On the shield you will see that same crest of a lion, and on his short sword he had acquired many nicks. Showa had an unrelenting sense of duty and justice, and he was considered the leader of this group. Next, Archmage Afton had chosen a young dwarf named Harold. Like most dwarves, Harold was short and stocky, but unlike them, Harold was full of joy and optimism. He was always looking at the brighter side of the situation. He was more of a beacon in this group than anything else. He wielded a lute and a flute, just like his mentor Afton. But he did so with less grace, less panache. Archmage Puck had chosen a mighty dragonborn as her student. His name was Marshall, and he was covered in armor head to toe, and the only way you could tell that he was a dragonborn was from a protruding burgundy and teal snout from his helm. And you could see him standing next to Harold and Showa, and he was holding a mighty two-handed hammer. And he was resting the very end of the hammer on his shoulder plate, kind of watching along. And finally, Archmage Horus the healer, had made a controversial choice to pick a very young student. He was only 14, and he was a half-elf by the name of Holt. Holt was a slender boy with silver hair, and he looked up to the rest of his companions. You would see him nervously standing there, shifting from foot to foot as he held this spell book that seemed too big for him. You're now watching these 4 individuals, and you see the reflection of fireworks happening in front of them off their faces. They all seem nervous. Showa's trying his best not to show it. The 4 had been given very strict orders to only join the battle once every one of the archmages had fallen in battle. And only then would they be allowed to continue the fight. They've been given a backup mechanism to be able to contain Thor's Dawn. It was, instead of the 5 amulets, it was 4 amulets. But as they stood there, they were in shock and awe of what they were witnessing. It had been 4 days since the battle had begun, and all participants were in a significantly weaker state than when they started. But still, these 4 individuals knew they would be easily defeated and killed if they were to join the battle. The force of the magic and power being thrown out was enough to knock the air still out of their lungs. They stood there, weapons drawn, dumbstruck, and fearful. And in the final hours of the battle, you finally see the archmages gain some ground on Thor's Dawn. And through a noble sacrifice. You would see Puck imbued with the last of Horus's and Afton's magical abilities, charging at Thoristan, knocking him down to his knees, and at the same time, Ira and Eden are contorting what little power they have left into these 5 amulets, and you'll see Thoristan his figure slowly evaporating into this thick black smog, and it will go into 5 different clouds, and it will be sucked into these amulets. The battle was finally over. Silverpine was saved for what they thought would be forever. In this battle, all of the archmages had died, but at the same time had been brought back by either Eden or Horus's healing. Finally, what they thought, one of the dark gods, had been vanquished. This battlefield became sacred and worshipped as peace was brought to Silverpine. A lot of citizens of Silverpine will actually visit this battlefield just to pay homage to the archmages and their great battle. Much was to be done now, though. The archmages quickly went back to the kingdom, and all vowed to each protect their amulet. And the amulet was split up between the 5 archmages. And peace and prosperity reigned in Silverpine. Silverpine University opened to not just the richer parts of their citizens, but every citizen was allowed to go to Silverpine University for any class or lecture. And 5 more years passed, and you see the Fathom 4 growing in strength, all training under their archmage mentor. And you see this shift again as these archmages put down their weapons and became known as the Council again, doing more political work than battling against any dark gods. They would launch many programs and financial support for all citizens of Silverpine Kingdom, and in this, all citizens were happy. The Fathom Four became more leaders in the community, and they became known as great warriors to everyone. In the year 475 of this world, there was another transition, though. The lead archmage, Ira, the great summoner, the leader of the council, the holder of the crystal torch, would pass and die due to old age. She was only human in the end, though. There was a great mourning that swept over all of Silverpine and even leaked out into some of the smaller cities surrounding Silverpine. This woman helped save all of Silverpine. There was a huge funeral procession in the streets, and there was much weeping. And the remaining 4 archmages, you see another shift happen between them as they lost their leader, their calm leader, who always, no matter what happened, showed that she she would not bow to the darkness. Afton and Puck started thinking a lot after Ira's death. And they were seeing over these past 5 years how Ira, her magic power stayed the same pretty much, but her human form kind of shriveled and shrunk. And then they realized that they didn't want to go out that way. They would want to go out in battle, strong and fierce instead of shriveled like Ira was. Yes, Silverpine was saved, but the world knows so much more to spare. They decided to travel outside of Silverpine, helping all of those that they could. They would leave behind their amulets with the remaining 2 archmages and take up their weapons once more to fight against the remaining 9 dark gods. They were tired of hiding away behind the gates of Silverpine. In this last 5 years, Puck actually grew to hate staying in Silverpine. She longed for the heat of battle once more. So arrangements were made, and a small ceremony between the archmages and the Fathom Four happened. The passing of the amulet to the last 2 archmages. Marshall and Harold, their apprentices, begged them, pleaded with them asking if they could go with them. But Puck and Afton were uncertain of their future, didn't want to endanger Marshall and Harold's potential and lives in this quest that they had. In the dead of night, would leave Silverpine Kingdom and head to Archmage Ruins. Many thought that Archmage Ruins acquired its name from the battle with Thoristan, but it was actually this night that would crown the ruins its name. The complete death of the Archmages. This battle between Horus and Eden would only last 12 hours, but it was fierce and powerful, reminiscent of the past battle that was fought here. In the years that they had known each other, Horus and Eden had learned and memorized each other's battle strategies. They were quite familiar with each other. And instead of tricks or strategies, for the majority of this battle, it was just one of pure power, as magical spells were flung. Now, there's something else that I forgot to explain. Each archmage had a certain item that was the focus of their power. Something that helped them channel the power that Silverpine held and channel that into a reality that they could use. Eldif the goddess had blessed these lands with power, and the archmages would use these items to be able to summon upon that power. And you would see Horus's sword that formed a cross casting a final spell against Eden as he is blown back, and Eden's relic was a skeleton ring around his finger that had sealed itself to him. And you'll see Eden try to stand once more to continue the fight, but he is too exhausted to do it. Horus, leaning on his sword, would make his way over. And you will see Horus cutting off Eden's finger that held the skeleton ring, rendering him powerless. Many hours before he had ran out of his own magic, he was using only the magic that the ring gave him. And Eden, screaming in pain as he lost his magical connection, also lost a finger as well. Horus standing back up to finish the job, but he couldn't do it. He had too deep a respect for Eden, this man that he had fought many battles with, and it didn't feel right to kill the man that fought next to him. But it has shown that they both couldn't be in the same place without conflict, so something had to be done. Horus would then banish Eden from Silverpine. No longer could he step a foot inside those gates or witness this beauty or take part of their celebrations. He would have to carve out his own path outside of Silverpine after he had sacrificed so much for the city. Defeated and powerless, in the dead of the night, Eden would leave. But this time there was no ceremony for his amulet. He would secretly take his amulet with him as he carved out his own path. And you pan out again to the Archmage Ruins, and you see 4 individuals standing among the tree line that had witnessed this last battle of the Archmages. The Fathom 4 had witnessed this last battle. They did not speak of it, but simply went on their way. As a few days later, Horus the Healer would declare himself king and sought to change the political landscape of Silverpine itself. He now held 4 of the amulets of Thor's Dawn and all of the relics of the Archmages, giving Puck and Afton had left theirs behind, since outside of Silverpine's gates, the Archmage relics no longer work. Horus made a new decree. The army of Silverpine would be governed by 1 commander and 7 lieutenants. King Horus would name Showa, Eden's apprentice, the new commander of the army. Showa thought to himself, was this out of guilt for what happened to Eden? Or was it out of respect for Showa? Showa's life would change from this point on as commander, nevertheless, but also he would always be uneasy around Horus. Weary of the king, untrusting, as he saw what he did to his dear friend. The rest of the Fathom 4, Marshall, Holt, and Harold, were named 3 out of the 7 lieutenants, working directly under Commander Showa. needing more lieutenants, the king would have a trial, a games, if you will, and 4 more powerful individuals would be chosen out of the army to be lieutenants. They were Daisy, a strong cleric and believer in Eldath; Neswin, a dwarven warrior who wielded her shield with a ferocity unknown in Silverpine. There was Terra, a Kenku, who had been raised by a rich merchant family inside of Silverpine's kingdom. But he had become a master of stealth. He could enter a building and exit it without even a whisper happening. And then there was Xena, an elf who was only described in battle as a tornado of daggers. But whenever anyone tried to look into her past and where she came from in Silverpine, they were only met with questions. There was one more decree that King Horus would make. He would name a young genius, a young outsider, to be his royal advisor. The name of this advisor was Icarus. And the king benefited greatly from advisor Icarus's thoughts and contemplations of what Silverpine should do next. The years would roll on through Silverpine, and this peace that Silverpine knew became its normality. Thoristan was nothing more than a legend at this point. The army was still there to defend against bandits and marauders, and King Horus was fair and just to all of the people. But the years would keep rolling on, and another great transition, probably not as great, but in the year 495, something happened. Commander Showa, Lieutenant Holt, Lieutenant Harold, and Lieutenant Marshall would always go horse riding at dusk through some old forest paths that reminded them of their old training days. They would laugh and sing and have fun. But on this fateful day, through the brush, you would hear whizzing a single black arrow as it pierces through the brush, and it would hit Lieutenant Harold square in the chest. Holt would scream, demount off of his horse, and quickly run over to try to heal him as Showa and Marshall would run through the brush seeking who shot that arrow. Harold would pass away from his injuries seconds after being hit. This arrow had magical presence behind it. Showa and Marshall would find Holt sitting and crying over the ashes of his best friend, as this arrow had turned Harold completely to dust. As the weeks passed, there was a funeral procedure, and all of Silverpine mourned and cried. Maybe even more so than when Naira died, as Harold's music and laughter and jokes and smile had touched everyone in Silverpine. Yes, Ira had saved Silverpine from Thoristan, but Harold had saved them from hopelessness. Showa and Marshall would continue to struggle with their friend's death, but looking into who shot that arrow was a dead end everywhere. The trail went cold for them, and they would find each of their own ways to be able to cope with Harold's death. They would become closer as friends. They no longer went on horseback rides or laughed as much, but would spend most of their free time in solitude thinking. Holt, however, looking up to Harold and seeing Harold as his best friend, who had gotten him through so much stress and depression and traumatic events that Holt had been through, would go crazy. Not crazy in a identifiable way, but crazy in his own mind as he thought. Holt was a thinker. Holt would search every square inch of Silver Pine for who killed his friend Harold. He couldn't find any evidence, though. He couldn't find anything to figure out who shot that arrow. He vowed to himself that he would avenge the death of Harold, no matter what the costs were. He grew cold in his emotions, no longer having Harold there to brighten his day. He saw his troops and everyone around him as only resources to accomplish his goal. King Horus, in spite of this traumatic event, didn't want to host another game to find a new lieutenant, so he just went through the ranks and picked out one that him and Showa agreed would be a great lieutenant. This lieutenant was a half-orc named Otis. And now, after all this story, this brings us to the year 500, where our present story begins. The commander and each lieutenant had their own banners. Left to right, of course, you will see the golden short sword banner of Showa, Commander Showa. Next is the two mountain peaks and a river, and that was Lieutenant Daisy's banner in honor of Eldaf, the goddess of nature. Next is the hammer and nail banner of Marshall, who always, his one strategy in battle was to hammer through them and destroy them, break their will. Then the next four lieutenants you had on left to right, the red whipping the book was Lieutenant Holtz, who in his coldness grew to be obsessed with obedience, and he strove to implant that in all of his soldiers that he had under him. Next, on the orange banner was, with the brick shield, was one of Neswin, the dwarven warrior. Her shield wall was unpenetrable. She strove to have the best defense. Next, you saw the purple banner of Lieutenant Terra. And all his troops were master of stealth. Next was the pink banner, Xena, the close range specialist, who taught all her troops to be deadly in close range, a enigma in close range. Next is bring us to Lieutenant Holt. I'm sorry, not Lieutenant Holt, Lieutenant Otis. A lot of names I got going on. This half-orc young leader who grew to have his own division when he became lieutenant. And now we'll go back to where we first started this story. There was a distress beacon in Silver Pine. A magical distress beacon that was only sent once to the surrounding bigger cities that fought to starve off the darkness outside of their walls. Most of the cities even thought this was a joke, since Silverpine was always much more well off than the rest of the cities in their defense. Or some thought, if something can attack Silverpine and they need help, there's no way that we'll be able to help them. Something that powerful. There were 3 heroes, 3 adventurers, I guess would be more suiting to call them that answered the call. One was a drunken master named Rum. The next one was a Aarakocra druid named Asik. And last was a tiefling paladin named Remorse. They would make their way individually to Silverpine, and 2 weeks after this distress beacon had emanated from Silverpine's walls, they would all arrive at the same time outside the gates, almost as if fate brought them together. And they would introduce themselves and meet outside the gates, and then they would push into the gates. They would see 5 small children, some boys, some girls, beaten and battered, hobbling their way down a stone path. And they would pay these 3 adventurers no mind as they pushed on outside of Silverpine. This seemed to shake each adventurer to their core, as they've never seen something quite so hopeless before. They would continue on through a keep and through the forest on a dirt path until they would come upon a small clearing with a bunch of battered tents set up haphazardly, and see some citizens milling around, tending to their wounds. And as they entered this makeshift camp, a young boy would hobble up to them, and as they looked at him, he was on crutches and he was missing his left leg completely. And they would each introduce themselves, and then he would introduce himself as Captain Obadiah. You could call him Obi for short. And he would say that he is the last soldier in this camp of Silverpine, and it was hard to call him a soldier. He was so young, especially missing a leg. He probably wouldn't be able to fight much. And just as he was trying to explain the situation, these 3 adventurers were hear growling happening as around 14 to 16 hellhounds sprang out from the forest and started ripping these tents and biting and clawing any flesh that they could find. They would quickly go to work and start dispatching the hellhounds, losing some citizens in the process. And they would kill all the hellhounds except for one. One that seemed to be leading the hellhounds, observing from a distance. And they would notice that this hellhound had a sickening scar across its left eye. And it would run away once all the other hellhounds had died. And once they had gotten a hold of the situation, and the citizens, without a beat, just started tending. Half of them will start tending to the wounded. The other half would start making graves. They would go back to Captain Obadiah, and he would say that Silverpine was attacked by some kind of pillar that kept summoning monsters. And they couldn't hold out. And they were pitched out of the city. And his last orders from his commander was to get what remaining citizens outside of the city and put the dome up. This didn't make much sense to the adventurers. What kingdom throws out their citizens? And he asked a favor of the party, only having 50 gold on him left, he gave it to them. These being very experienced adventurers, that was nothing more than a fair to even get here, much less the battle that they had just fought. But Obi ensured them that there'll be more gold once they get back deeper into Silverpine. He had asked them to reinforce a small bridge house. He had sent his last patrol of men there to see if they could defend that choke point while he got the rest of the people out before he joined them again. They agreed, but having arrived very late into Silverpine, it was already night, so they decided to rest for the night in these tents. They slept with one eye open as they feared another attack of hellhounds. Remorse would wake after her nightly shift of watch, and she would wake up and her 2 compatriots were missing. All she was able to find, any trace she was able to find in them, was just a simple note that said, "Gone scouting, be back soon." So that would be one of the last times that Remorse would see Asic or Rum, and she had grown somewhat fond of their shenanigans. She would wait a little bit into the morning, but finally she had to leave to continue to be able to support this last patrol that Obi had said. But before she left, Obi gave her one more thing. He said that his friend, Advisor Icarus, had given him some advice and given him this little magical item. And as she looked at it, it was a small skeleton ring. She would take it and put it on her hand, and as soon as it put it into her hand, it would twist a little bit, and she would feel small bones protruding into her finger, latching on, and she'll hear a small click. She was very well experienced with magical items, and she seemed to get the distinct feeling that this was a cursed item. Obi would tell her to be on the lookout for Advisor Icarus. Make sure he's okay. He said he had to go back for something. And Captain Obadiah, or Obi, would then become the captain again and start directing the citizens outside of Silverpine onto the path. They were only a few hours away. Remorse would then go deeper into Silverpine, going through some light forest and following the winding path. She would come to a swamp with a broken wooden path. And as she trudged through this swamp, her armor weighed her down, and she had to go very slowly through it until she finally came upon a small island with a tree in the middle of the swamp. She headed towards it to rest for a couple moments. And as she got closer to this island, she would see a body. She would see a middle-aged man with royal garb trying to motion for her. And as she got closer, you could see that he was trying to speak, but only a slight bit of air was coming out. And as she got within 10 feet of him, she heard a slight click, and then a bomb will go off as his entire chest cavity would explode with necrotic damage, blowing her back, damaging her significantly, and instantly killing this man. She would search his body, and she would find a note in his pocket. A note that had been halfway smudged and destroyed from that explosion. And it says, "Dear Captain Obadiah, we tried our best to hold out, but we were ambushed by at the smudged house. The blank is dangerous. You're the only hope left for Silver Smudge. The darkness grows stronger, and I hear the smudge chasing me. It has been an honor to serve with you. and written down, signed in the bottom, was the name Advisor Icarus. She didn't have much time to contemplate what this note meant, as she was swarmed by these spider-like folks with their eerie, pale, slimy skin as they crawled down from these swamp trees, and she fought valiantly to kill them all. She progressed through the swamp after killing these creatures, and yet again she was met by them, and knowing of their tricks, she was able to easily dispatch them, but one of them ran off, and you could see it alarm something, signal something, as this entire tree was destroyed and broken, it being hollow as this giant monstrosity of a larger version of this spider-like being. And you could see its entire flesh shimmering with slime and worms going in and out of its skin. She was no match for it, with its razor-sharp claws and poisonous teeth, as it would kill her. Remorse the Paladin would die in this swamp. But that wasn't the last time she would die. As, fading out of consciousness, her hand would come into sight. The hand that held the skeleton ring. And it would glow a white-blue light. And she would come back into consciousness. At a much higher discipline, paladins would have, as you could say, an angel form. That they can, it's an ability that they will be able to activate, but only the most disciplined paladins in their oath will be able to activate this. Remorse did have this ability, but this felt different as she entered this angel form. Instead of angel wings, it was chained wings that would wrap around her torso and give her the power to be able to defeat this monstrosity. Confused and battered, she sought for an ending to this nightmare swamp. She would continue on through the swamp, and it would lead to a slight rise in the forest, and then eventually level out, and there'll be a great plain area. And as she wandered through these plains, all around her were these giant boulders that had been placed in the plains, which she thought was by design, but as she looked closer, she saw that there were bodies under these boulders, smashed. The blood and guts were oozing from the outside of the bottom of these rocks, and she did notice one large boulder in particular, kind of in the center of all this chaos, and she would walk up to it, and it would be a young half-orc man wearing a green cloak. She could still see his face, as the majority of his body was smashed under this boulder, and right before him, implanted in the ground, was his great bow with a steel tip on the bottom, and it had been smashed into the ground like it was someone was preparing to fire it. And sensing some magical presence from us, not learning her lesson from the skeleton ring, she would touch this great bow, and all of a sudden her vision would blur, and she would be sent to this vision. She would see a young half-orc boy around the age of 5 running through the woods, and then he will stop at a giant oak tree, and you'll see him running back, and then later on you will see his half-orc father following him as he ran back to his tree, and he would point at it, and His father would laugh and say, "That's a little big for you, isn't it?" Over the summer, as the boy grew, they would cut down this giant tree and drag it back to their small homestead. They would have it in the barn, and you'll see Otis, this half-orc boy, learning how to carve as he's carving a little bit of his tree, learning a lot from his father, spending great memories with him, and carving this giant great bow out of his tree. His father would then teach him how to polish the wood and carve archonic runes into it, and he would have this great bow, but he was still missing the string. And he would then go to his mother. His human mother would teach him how to kind of string together, crochet this silk string that had been woven. And as they wove together this string, they would speak magical secrets into it to make this rope much stronger than any normal bow. And finally, after years and years of working on this bow, it would be finished, and Otis would be able to train with it. And for the first time, he would pull back the string, an ethereal blue arrow would form on the string and knock itself in place. And he would let go. The arrow would whistle through the air, and as it hits his target, a giant archonic explosion would happen. 20 feet high, 20 feet wide, as everything in this orb of destruction was wiped out. Remorse will still be in this vision as she watches him train with this and rise through the ranks of Silverpine Militia and be chosen by King Horus to be a lieutenant. She would then flash back to a very dark night as she sees Lieutenant Otis running with all these citizens, and as she watches him, he turns around and looks up into the sky, and something's dropping boulders, and she'll see this huge elder dark dragon flying over, and Lieutenant Otis would, in his desperation, turn around and looking around to see, she could see in his eyes that maybe he could save a couple citizens. And he would slam the great bow into the ground and pull back, and you'll see the same ethereal arrow appear, and he'll let go, and you'll hear an explosion, and you'll see a slight smile from Otis. And the next thing is, it's dark as a boulder will land on Otis immediately after that smile. And as she lets go of the bow, she realizes only a couple seconds has passed. What seems to be years have passed through this vision. She's out of breath, she's exhausted, and she has a headache now. She hears fluttering above her. Something... Is there a downwind right here? And as she looks up, there's the same giant elder dragon that she saw. It's missing part of its wing and its right arm, but it's still able to fight as it lands down and roars in front of Remorse. But before Remorse can react, and before the dragon can react, her skeleton ring that she has on her hand glows again, and an ethereal figure, hooded figure, appears in front of her and faces the dragon and outstretches his left hand and then closes it suddenly. The dragon starts evaporating into white particles as the wind picks it up and throws it everywhere into the night. And this ethereal figure she would hear it say, "Not today. Not right now, at least." And she will see this ethereal figure, this man in this cloak, turn towards her. She'll notice his gentle features and his smile. He will then disappear and the ring will stop glowing. Having so much to contemplate and think about, she would rest under a nearby tree. She was so exhausted that she fell into a deep sleep, and she kept having these visions of that same man standing there, with still images of his smile flashing. Remorse was born to a well-off family in the small town of Drake Garden. At the age of 2, something happened though. Her entire house, as well as with her family, was burned down and burned to death. In the ashes of her home, at the age of 2, she was found by a young abbot of the local orphanage of Drake Garden, who took her in. See, the reason behind the burning of the house and the killing of her family was the city of Drake Garden and all its citizens was convinced that demons were being summoned by Remorse's family. So they wanted to deal with these necromancers in the only way that they saw fit. Remorse would change her name to Remorse and become a paladin under her god, and she would live through her experience as an orphan and let it empower her. She chose the name Remorse for a very good reason. There was more of her family out there, more of them summoning devils and demons and causing all this pain to everyone. So she picked up her sword and became a paladin of revenge. She would travel to nearby cities and track down her family, never telling anyone of her secret. She became somewhat famous as a paladin, tracking down necromancers and taking out devils and demons. Her actions were celebrated in small cities, and she became well renowned. No one knowing of the pain of loneliness that she felt, as her single mission was to destroy her own family. Now we flash back to the present. Remorse is waking up, and she sees Silver Pine for the first time, and she would wake up and see this beautiful sunrise over Silver Pine and be taken aback by its beauty. But uneasiness would settle over her as she realized how vacant it seemed. And she heard something behind her, and she would look behind her, and 2 more individuals were walking down this same path that she came from the swamp. One seemed to be human, and the other one seemed to be a larger cat-like form. And she would greet them, and they would introduce themselves. Their names were Foster and JoDargo. Foster was a bard, and JoDargo was a barbarian, and they had become close friends over the years. Both of them were adventurers, mercenaries, in a way. Foster had come from a small city called Mellon. He had grew up there, and he had the luxury of having a family there. But it was taken away from him as throughout his teenage years, his mother was sick. He would do everything that he could to be able to heal her of this disease, but no matter any means, non-magical or magical, he was unsuccessful. That was what started his journey into the magical arts, and she always loved to listen to him play, though. It seemed to at least rise her spirits Until one day, nearing adulthood, he would watch as his mother would pass to her disease. His father wasn't with them during that time because he was off at war. The city of Melon was fighting some of the orcish nation that had kept marauding their city. A few days after his mom had passed, he would receive the news that his father was missing in action, declared dead. Having nothing left to tie him down, Foster would begin adventuring. He would meet with a young mercenary calling himself JoDargo. JoDargo was from the Sands, the Serpent Sands. He was from a tribe of cat-like beings who roamed through and would harvest what little there was of the land and hunt. And they were great warriors. The only problem with JoDargo is that he couldn't control his anger that he had. His anger at the world for being how it is, its unfairness to him and his people. And this anger that consumed him will lash out at those around him that he loved. His family quickly became scared of him, scared of what he would do with this anger. And he would slowly see everyone around him that he loved isolate from him. His anger only grew in his solitude, however, and eventually into his adulthood he would continue on the same path as an adventurer, hiring himself out as a mercenary to get what money he could as he traveled from city to city, until he met Foster. JoDargo didn't like to travel a lot with other companions because it always had the same outcome of them being scared of him and running away, leaving him in the dead of night. But he did meet this one bard named Foster who seemed to have a patience about him, a quietness that understood JoDargo's solitude. They became quite close friends until one day they would receive that same distress signal and arrive a few days late from the original party. And they would meet Captain Obadiah, and Captain Obadiah by that time had all the citizens out of Silver Pine that were left alive, and they would go in and they would see Captain Obadiah activate some kind of dome that would open up each of these Silver Pine gates, and these small blue crystals would form at the top of it, and then they would shoot out a light that would form a dome around all of Silver Pine. And Captain Obadiah told him that he's going to try to make it back to Commander Showa, but he had to make a quick stop first now that he had activated the dome, and that this dome would keep everything out that was out and everything in that was in. Foster and JoDargo knew that there was no turning back now, so they pressed on through the swamp, and they realized that someone was ahead of them as they found no resistance at all. And they would eventually come upon Remorse. And Remorse, Foster, and JoDargo would all exchange greetings and all be confused. Remorse, not trusting this duo, would keep what happened the day before to herself. And they would continue through this plains area. Remorse would let JoDargo hold on to his great bow as it suited his physique more than hers. And they would finally arrive at the bridge house as the plains would arch up and then go straight down, overlooking this bridge house that also overlooked the bridge as well. It would and this bridge crossed over this mighty roaring river, the Rio River of Silver Pine. And this small broken down cabin that you had seen before as just being erected was now desolate and broken down. They would travel to it, and Upon stepping in it, they would find these shadowy figures that seemed to suffocate them. They would do battle with them, and they would come out on top. And lighting up this cabin, they would find a huddled mass in the corner. The only reason that they were able to see this individual huddled in the corner was there was smoke. He was smoking a cigarette. He introduced himself as Thrax. He was a private in Silver Pine's militia, or what was left of the militia. He was probably the exact opposite of what they had thought of Silver Pine was. Educated and articulate. Thrax was the exact opposite. But they were happy to have some sort of guidance in this land. So Thrax would continue across the bridge and bring them to a small tree in the middle of the forest once passing the Rio River. And he would knock on it 3 times, and they would be amazed as the trunk of this tree would open up like a door. And as they traveled down the stairs that led past it, they saw a small underground encampment full of tents, just like they passed with Captain Obadiah. And they would meet Commander Showa, who was in charge of what little was left of Silver Pine's militia. And he would explain to them that they were in the city and patrols would start going missing, and then some of the men on the gate, on the wall, saw this dark pillar in the distance. And it would inch closer and closer by day. And it finally appeared very close, and there was these ravenous monsters that kept attacking the city. Eventually, there was a call made to all of Silver Pine for all citizens to go within the kingdom's walls to protect themselves, as they didn't know where this enemy was or where it was coming from. So with all the citizens gathered in the city, one truth became very evident: that there wasn't enough supplies for all of them. There wasn't even enough room, really. They were packed in. So King Horus called a vote to all the important figures, all the lieutenants and the commander and the advisor, and they came up with a plan. There was a rift that had been appearing quite evidently in Silver Pine, one of the richer class and one of the poorer class. The distinction being whoever was born within the city's walls was of more prestige than anyone born outside of it. So that's what they used to divide the people up. Everyone born outside of Silver Pine's walls was considered a peasant. And they were considered the peasant class. As Commander Showa would explain this, he would say that that's about half the population and about 60% of the Silver Pine militia that were born outside of its kingdom walls. And he would explain he was born outside those walls as well, and one of his lieutenants as well, Lieutenant Otis. The 3 would then explain that they found Lieutenant Otis, and there you will see some of the 20-odd men that were sleeping in these tents. Some of them would start crying as their lieutenant had passed away. Show would then explain that they were kicked out in the middle of the night with all the peasant class, all the people. 5,000 citizens and 1,000 soldiers rushed into the night, all heading for the tree line. Showa explains that he knew what was coming, and it was slaughter. Only about half of them got to the tree line. He explains he quickly sent Lieutenant Otis and Captain Obadiah on a mission with half the soldiers and the remaining citizens to get them out of Silver Pine. And once that's been done, to activate the dome that will at least protect the outside world from whatever thing is attacking them. And once that is done, to meet them here at this old forward post that he had known about. And he explained that he had been trying to defend the tree line with what little men and resources he had left, knowing not of what happened to Silverpine. They had sent up many distress signals, but he doesn't know why most of them didn't go through. You'll see him, a single tear come down his cheek as he explains all this. He doesn't know what happened, what's happening right now inside the walls of Silverpine. He doesn't know what's happening with his other 6 lieutenants that he cherished. But he does explain there is some hope, though. In Silverpine University, all the way to the northwest, there is weapons in there. There's the weapons of the Archmages. They're kept there for research purposes and for general viewing to the public. If the adventuring party can reach the university, then maybe they'll have a chance to have enough power to be able to fight back this Dark Pillar. And he gives them a map of the place and supplies, and he says that he can't spare any more men to guide them on their path, but he can spare Private Thrax, the smoking countryman who they met just hours before in the bridge house. And they are given 200 gold pieces each. And they notice as Showa shakes Private Thrax's hand and tells him that he no longer owes a debt to Silverpine. And he is free of his responsibilities once he guides you all to Silverpine University. You'll see a couple men come up to JoDargo, who has Lieutenant Otis's bow on his back, and they'll say to him to wield that with great responsibility because a great man had that bow before him, and to honor his name with it. And as they're leaving, walking up the steps, each of the party members will get another vision. One that's become... These visions that became too common for Remorse, but it was a new experience for JoDargo and Foster. They would see a vision of Advisor Icarus sitting in the corner of a tavern, smoking a cigarette and drinking. And as they looked on their map, they realized that his observatory is not too far away, so they could make a pit stop of it to stop there before continuing on to the university. And on their way, they'll meet a mysterious figure walking through the woods. A tiefling by the name of Sorrow, who had declared herself a necromancer and was a very cheery one at that. For whatever reason, she needed to go to the university. So after much talking and negotiating, it was put into place that she would continue with them to the university. But they would keep a close eye on her as they didn't trust her, this necromancer. They would continue on to Icarus's observatory. Before Icarus had become the royal advisor, it was just simply known as the observatory, but that was one of the benefits that he got when King Horus named him that. And they would break into his observatory and start searching the place. At his secretary's desk, they would find a note that says, "Please cancel all my meetings for today and tomorrow. I have some personal business to attend to." And then in his private chambers, they would see a demonic circle on the top room and blood ritual circles being created. And they would find a book in the center of this circle. And as they flip through it, they would see some very old pages in the beginning, and the only one that they can make out is some writing. It says, "Finally, everything is coming to a head. The illusions had a lasting effect effect that I did not think about. And as they flip through, they see some newer entries. And the dates match up to just a couple weeks ago. And it would say, tonight should be the beginning of a new chapter for me. Finally, Thor's Dawn has blessed me. And then they'll see another entry, a newer entry, a couple days after that one. It says, I did not believe that my companion will be as helpful as they have been. All it took was a little blackmail and a couple lies, and I have an insider. And even a newer entry, a couple days after that one, was the last one that they saw. And this one, the page was torn and covered in soot. And they noticed that there was a couple fingerprints on the side, what looked like to be blood. And it said, it was all a mistake. I did not fully understand what I unleashed upon this world. I was able to steal the skeleton ring and Horus's cross before getting away. Those poor souls left in the city. I must be quick though, the hunters are after me. I hear them. I don't have enough strength to carry the cross, but I must get the skeleton ring to Obi. At least he'll be able to get it to one of the adventurers. And after reading through this book, they realize that whatever this dark god named Thor's Dawn had been unleashed upon the land, and it seemed to be Icarus's doing. Sorrow would continue to look around in these libraries of Icarus, and she would find a particularly interesting book of custom variation of spells. And she would flip to one page, and it seemed to be a spell variation of Major Illusion. And he called it Greater Major Illusion in all his creativity. And in the entry it said, spell variation works wonders on those who don't know magic. Greater Major Illusion. It's Major Illusion, but it can affect everyone in a 2-mile radius. Regular spell, but you must sacrifice a white dove and save it. The incantation will say something in Abyssal as she read over it. And then there's some more scribbling down after the entry. And it says, side note, even I thought the demons looked real. Must have really confused those townspeople. And they would find no more notes or anything of importance in the observatory. And as they were heading out, they were getting a weird vibe off of this statue of Torm that was outside of the observatory. And as they got closer to it, Sorrow heard a voice in her head asking her to crave the power. That the power was in the university and that she needed to take it. And in her stunned silence, she caught the attention of the other three, and not trusting her, JoDargo tried to blow up the statue. And it turned from a statue of Torm to one of Thor's Dawn. Icarus had hid that right under the noses of everyone with an illusion spell. They ended up destroying the statue as they kept on their journey to the university. And as they continued through the woods, it would take them days to even get to the halfway point that they were heading to, the Moongrave Pass. After days of walking, every night they would have weird visions. Foster would have visions of a man, 5 men, surrounded on a hilltop by orcs. And he would see as those 5 men discussed something between them and fought off the orcs for days, until finally 4 of the 5 men would run off as one man charges towards the encampment of the orcs. And he would see this man, he would recognize something. He would recognize the sword. And he recognized it as Thrax's sword. It was the same sword and make. So he recognized this being as Thrax as he charged down into the orc encampment in his vision. And Thrax would go on to kill many of those orcs, but eventually he was captured and tortured. And this happened all over the course of many visions. Foster was seeing his vision, Thrax being tortured for a week long. And then Remorse had even stranger visions of... It wasn't even more of a vision as it was more of an interaction she would have every night with this hooded figure that she saw that first night. He called himself Eden. And he alluded to something. She would ask him questions and he would answer with abstract and mysterious as he could. What she didn't know was that Sorrow was having the same interaction with Eden. They were sitting in this study of sorts at a desk and right across from each other, and each of them will be asking questions to Eden, learning more of themselves and of Eden. But sometimes Sorrow didn't have this vision with Eden. She had a darker one where she would see this swirling abyss, and it would speak to her about garnering the power in the university to claim what is rightfully hers. Finally, JoDargo would be having these different visions. He would be flying over the Serpent Sands. Some nights he would see him angry. Just see himself just angry, just pacing back and forth in a cage. And then other nights, this woman would speak to him. She called herself Eldath. She called herself a goddess, and she will say that he needs to let go and to claim his full power. And these visions will confuse them even more as they headed to Moongrave Pass. And just before they were able to arrive there, they walked into a clearing. And they stopped to rest. And as they rest, they heard the fluttering of wings, and there's almost a PTSD to Remorse. And they looked up and they saw... She recognized the two beings that were flying above them. It was Asik, the Arrow-Croaker druid that she arrived in Silverpine with, and he was carrying in his talons and in his arms the drunken master named Rum. And they would drop down, and she would immediately notice that they were not the same. They were stumbling, and their eyes were just a pitch black as they charged towards the party, and a fierce battle would then erupt between them. It would take hours for them to finally defeat the two. After killing off Rum and critically injuring Asik, Remorse would come close to Asik as he motioned, laying on the ground, his legs broken. She would hear Asik say that they were just the distraction. And as he says that, they notice that Thrax is no longer there with them, and they hear yelling off into the distance in the forest. During these visions, they were not speaking to each other about these visions, but they all received one vision that was the same. They would all see a hellhound with a scar over its left eye walking through the swamp, and then past the swamp and over the bridge, and then past the bridge over some more forest into Silverpine Kingdom. And the same hellhound with a scar over its left eye would walk through the front gates and walk through the upper kingdom walls and into a small private chamber. And you're only able to see the hellhound as it's looking up at something. And you hear some gruttal sounds speaking to the hellhound. You're not able to make out what it's saying. And the hellhound will nod its head. And then all of a sudden it will start yapping in pain, screaming in pain as it curls its body downward. And you'll hear cracking of ribs and tearing of flesh as the hellhound's back will sprout open. And out of his hellhound's body you will see some sort of claw-like thing emerging and slowly folding him and throwing itself onto the ground, and another one's going to come out as well, and then 3 more will start coming out. Whatever was coming out of his hellhound was impossibly large too large for it to be hiding inside this hellhound. Each of them individually came to the same conclusion during their own vision that whatever this thing was, it was being crafted by whatever dark god there was that was in Silverpine. And now we flash back to where they just finished their battle. Remorse hearing the words, "We were only the distraction." And bursting through the tree line is this horrible creature. The same scar over its left eye. Crab-like, but spider as well, with a giant mouth that takes up the majority of its body, with sharp rows of teeth, and the back of its head, it doesn't form into a regular head. It's just left open, as you can see its brain, and attached to its brain is these weird tentacles that lash out at anything that moves. You'll see this thing roar and charge towards the party. Thrax tells them to run, as he's already been trying to defend against this thing and his sword has been broken. And they would launch all their attacks they could at it, but it just bounced off of this armor, this monstrosity. Having no other alternative, they chose to run. They were close enough to Moongrave Pass that maybe they could make it there, but there was a couple obstacles in their path. They would quickly cross a small river, and as Scar chased them, this monstrosity is what they called it, Scar. They would arrive to Moongrave Pass, and they would see a couple undead zombies going towards the entrance, and then they'll notice that there was two privates fighting to hold off these undead. One wearing the crest of Commander Showa, and the other wearing the crest of Lieutenant Marshall. And they would run for the gate, and these two privates would notice them and hold the gate open for them and slam the door shut just as Scar was trying to reach it. But before they could get to the gate, they heard Scar talk to them. The chattering of its teeth created a dark and twisted voice emanating from it. And they would hear it say, "Run." And after that, it would look at each of them as they were running towards the gate. And it would say 5 things. It would say, "The orphan, the rage-filled, the summoner, the deserter, and the forgotten." And as it would say those things, the gates of Moongrave Pass would slam shut, just as the two privates that were sitting there by Commander Showa to guard it would close it and magically enhance the door so that nothing could get through. The party had finally made it to its halfway point, Moongrave Pass. But now they were being chased by some unspeakable adversary that they could not even damage in the slightest way. They had time to think now, though, because Moongrave Pass was buried deep inside the mountain range that separated the university from the rest of the kingdom. Hundreds of feet of concrete and iron and stone stood in between them and that thing out there. They quickly surveyed their surroundings as they walked into this large room, a clearing with large marble pillars coming down from it. And they would notice that there was 9 doors. 4 side doors on each side, and then 1 large door in the middle. And as they tried to go through the pass to continue on to maybe get some headway on their adversary, to maybe make it to the university before it did, they realized that the main gate was locked by 8 locks. A gold, a black, a blue, a red, a orange, a purple, and a pink. And a green one. Quickly they realized the game that was afoot, but they didn't know who the players were. And they would go to each of the doors and figure out which one was unlocked. Trying all of them, and then the last one would finally unlock. Above it was the banner of Lieutenant Otis with his portrait. The same one that they all recognized, except for Sorrow. They would travel through his rooms, and they would get more visions of how he led his men, how he took care of them and trained them. And they would have to fight off some creature of the night, an aboleth that had made its home in his Otis's training lake. And they would finally travel to the private office of Otis, finding many magical items that he seemed to have collected over the years. And they would arm themselves, and they would find the key. The green key that was in Lieutenant Otis's office. And as JoDargo would pick it up, his skin would shrivel. You would see veins appearing in his fur that the rest of the party did not know were there. And a sickly purple would overcome him as he would fall dead to the curse of the key. Whoever was playing on the other side of this game was playing a very deadly game and wanting them to die. They were able to resurrect JoDargo, but they became very weary that maybe it wasn't as safe as they initially thought. That maybe there were scarier things than Scar inside these walls. They would search the rest of Lieutenant Otis's office, finding nothing more. They would then go to his men's quarters and search through there to see if they could find anything. And they found a letter and a name in a locker with a name they recognized. Captain Obadiah. Apparently he served under Lieutenant Otis. And it said, the letter that they found in his locker said, "Dear Obi, I'm writing you to say how proud I am of you and your recent promotion as lieutenant in training. I bet you look so cute in your uniform. I wish I could see you, but you must be so busy with your new promotion and having a lot of men under your command now. And Icarus keeps me busy with my studies. I know it sounds pretentious and selfish, but some days it's draining to be royalty in such a large kingdom. But I love you, and I can't wait for fall when I can see you again. XOXO, Marcy." They would hold on to this letter, confused by what it really meant. They would then, after grabbing the green key and taking away its curse and making sure JoDargo was still breathing, they would continue on back to the main room where the other doors were. And they would speak with the two privates, Private Thomas and Private Hadley. And they would explain that Showa had sent men all along the way to be able to try to defend from whatever the Dark Pillar was sent to the party until they could get to the university in time, just as a extra support as much as Showa could provide. And they had been sent here to Moongrave Pass to be able to open up the doors and close them for the party. They had no idea, though, what was going on with these weird keys. They've never seen this before. It must have been the work of some magical caster. They would continue on to the next room. The room of Lieutenant Neswin, the Dwarven woman, the warrior of the shield. They would find the training rooms of Neswin and keep searching until they found her office, and they found a secret panel in the back of through a painting, and they were to go through and find her private quarters, her secret quarters at that point, where she worshipped a dwarven goddess named Baranar Truesilver. They also found another note, this time directed straight for Neswin. And it read, "The old man had ruled this army for too long. He has brought shame to us all by tarnishing its former glory. His era has passed. So has Marshall's. Meet with me and we can discuss. I already have 2 more who back me. Signed, Lieutenant Holt." They began to get the bigger picture of what was happening here, that Lieutenant Holt had taken residence in Moongrave Pass with 2 other lieutenants. They didn't understand how they got here from the city, but they thought that maybe with their visions that we were still having that maybe he was behind some of this. Maybe he was the insider that they thought. And every night that they stayed in Moongrave Pass, the intensity of their visions would continue. And it was here in Moongrave Pass that they started discussing each other's visions and starting putting everything together. Sorrow was having more visions of 4 horsemen riding through a forest path and a black arrow erupting through the brush and striking a young dwarf. And she recognized Showa from his portrait on the wall, and she thinks she recognized the other 2 men riding with him. Remorse was still having visions with Eden. He was getting more and more elaborate in his answers. Foster just kept seeing the same scene over and over again of Thrax being tortured, and finally he saw an ending to it where after a week, from the point of view of Thrax in this vision, he would see men attacking the orc encampment, and then he would see a young lieutenant be able to riding up after his men and destroy the orc encampment, and you'll hear this lieutenant say, "Look for survivors." Foster would recognize this lieutenant as Lieutenant Holt, as his portrait was hanging on the wall of the Moongrave Pass, which just added more complexity to everything. Who was Holt and why he had gone mad, and if he was he saved Thrax, but whenever he asked Thrax about it, he only got mutters, and Thrax would just walk away, or he would see Thrax start crying. JoDargo had a new vision, what looked like to be a carriage riding out of Silverpine, and a fully armored knight, just a single knight riding with this carriage. JoDargo could see the silhouette of what looked like to be a woman inside the carriage, and the rider was hooded, and the knight offered no distinguishable features. And these visions would just continue to play over and over every night they carry through this Moongrave Pass, playing this game of going through each room, finding notes here and there. And as they were searching through Neswin's room, they found another secret room. This time it led downward a staircase, a stone staircase. And it led to a dungeon where they found a crumpled figure in armor. And they recognized it from another one of the portraits in Moongrave Pass. It was Lieutenant Marshall. And he was battered and tortured. And they were able to wake him up and explain who they were. And he explained that he had stayed in the Silverpine City, but sent all his men with Showa because he knew that the city would eventually fall. Maybe he could at least save a couple of his men. And he explained that he had been defending the inner wall with Lieutenant Neswin when there was a surge of these creatures, and they were able to overtake Neswin and kill her, and they were able to climb over the wall. And so Marshall called for the retreat to the inner sanctum of the city. And in there, when he was still recuperating from this battle, he was struck, knocked out, and he could only remember certain things, but he thinks he remembers being dragged by Lieutenant Xena and Lieutenant Terra as he heard Lieutenant Holt talking, and they were in some kind of tunnel passage. And putting two and two together, they realized that that's how Lieutenant Holt and the other two lieutenants were able to get to Moongrave Pass. There was some secret tunnel leading from the city to here. They quickly helped Marshall back up, and they found Lieutenant Neswin's key, magical key, and were able to continue on their adventure into Moongrave Pass. The next room was Lieutenant Daisy's, and as they opened the door, it swung open to a much larger room than the other last two. It was huge. It was filled with vegetation and forest and plants of all sorts, but it wasn't a greenhouse. It was just a forest, a beautiful garden that had been crafted, and they would see a sign that says, Eldaf, the mother of nature and magic, has watched over Silver Pine since the beginning. She provides us the magic in these lands and creates the artifacts that provide us with protection. She is kind and welcoming to all. This is her inner sanctuary. Treat it with respect. And the party had kind of gone through a routine now. Search the room and try to find the key so they can move on and fight whatever dark creature there was hiding inside the room. But this one had no enemies in it, and it seemed peaceful. They almost wanted to stay here for a little bit. And as they searched and walked around this huge, vast room, they came to a small pond with a carved log bench on it. And each of them would see an ethereal figure, a ghost, playing a song. It was a dwarf. And he was playing a lute and singing. And then next to this pond was a sign that says, In Memorial of Lieutenant Harold. And they continue on through it, and they were able to find the key stashed inside the river. But they were also able to find a hidden sanctuary inside this place. And it was here that they were contacted by Eldaf, the goddess of nature, in the form of a water spirit. And they spoke with her, and she advised them to keep going and gave a little insight on Lieutenant Holt's madness that he had created inside of Moongrave Pass. That there was no logic behind it. You do not think that way. And she blessed them with some advice and answered some of their questions as they continued on. And they would continue on to another room. Lieutenant Terra's room. After searching through it and dealing with the riddles and illusions of the rogue known as Lieutenant Terra, they were able to find the key and continue on. And this time Lieutenant Marshall had recuperated enough to join them into the next venture, into the next room, which was his room. And he was able to get them some weapons that he had stashed away in there and show them around and find the key. And it was during this interaction that Sorrow the Tiefling Necromancer seemed to fall for Lieutenant Marshall. As he took his helm off for the first time, he was this scarred, beautiful dragonborn consisting of a burgundy and till. And in secret, they would exchange notes and poems and deepen their relationship. As they continued on through Lieutenant Marshall's room, days had passed since they had entered Moongrave Pass. How many they couldn't keep track of. The visions just seemed to give them headaches and confuse them even more, but they were slowly starting to pick up on the bigger picture. Lieutenant Marshall was able to fill in the gaps where he could. Something was nagging away at Remorse, though. These conversations that she had with Eden during her vision seemed to have a deeper purpose. She seemed especially connected to Eden. They would continue on to Lieutenant Zena's room, where it was different. It was made for them. And on a sign in the first part of the room, there was a note pinned to it. 2 notes, in fact. And the note said, "You may have righteousness in your minds, but your hands belong to the devils. May this key remind you of what you actually are." And it was at the bottom signed, Holt. And then the next note, cleverly origami folded into a key as they unwrapped it, it said, "This is a war of attrition, a war of our wills. You fight half-heartedly for a kingdom you care not for. Silverpine has no more gold to offer you, only the pain that you are also familiar with. Signed, Holt." And they would continue down this path through Lieutenant Zena's room, and they would realize that their names had been inscribed on the wall. And the first room that they would arrive into was covered with sand, and JoDargo would immediately recognize it as a place where he would spend a lot of his days thinking, overhanging a small temple in the Serpent Sands. It brought up a lot of bad memories for JoDargo, even more so when he found the note hidden in the room. And it said, "Are you still haunted by the stares of your family? An outcast who cares nothing for themselves or those around them. Your anger is selfish and drives everyone away. You will forever be alone in life and in death. This time will be no different, no matter who you temporarily direct your anger to. You don't care for Silverpine, and it doesn't care for you. Signed, Lieutenant Holt." And as they continued on, the next name that was scribbled on was Sorrow. And they would find a small laboratory of sorts where Sorrow and her family worked. And she would learn the necromantic arts from her uncle in this laboratory. Until while she was away, it was destroyed by a paladin. And in this husk of a room of a laboratory, she would find another note. And it wrote, "You confuse me the most. They still do not know about your true nature. How long do you plan to keep up this charade? They would not accept the cruel monster that you are. A temptress who hunts for the power that she believes will fill the holes in her heart. Can you hear the screams of the innocent? The ones that you corrupted away from this world? You do not care for Silverpine, and it does not care for you. Signed, Lieutenant Holt." And even deeper into this corridor, they will find another room. The name written on this door was Foster. And as he opened the door, he knew what was coming. He found a perfect replica of his old home in Melon. Everything was perfectly where it was supposed to be as he left it that day. Even down to the details of how he made the bed that his mother had laid in with her diseased body. And he found a note on the nightstand that read, "You can leave everything behind physically, but cannot leave behind the sorrow and loneliness that will follow you. In the end, you could do nothing to save her. You believe you are nothing. Are you a liar or a failure? You don't care for Silverpine, and it doesn't care for you." And by this time, they were questioning how was Lieutenant Holt able to gather so much about their past lives, and Thrax, who had seemed to be quite shaken by this point, explained that he, in his magical prowess, can look into people's pasts and use it against them, and he did it quite a lot with the enemies of Silverpine. He was always the chief strategist among the lieutenants. Cautiously and warily, they continued on their journey through Lieutenant Xena's room. The next room or department had Remorse written on it. And as she opened the door, it was a replica of the old orphanage that she grew up in. To the beds, to the toys that the orphans had, to the fireplace crackling and the rocking chair moving back and forth where the abbess had sat and read them stories as they went to sleep. And she would find a note sitting on that rocking chair that said, "Vengeance and justice don't live side by side. You cannot convince yourself otherwise. I see a scared little girl who is still pretending to be something better than the revenge that is choking her. The sins of our ancestors damn the descendants. You don't care for Silverpine, and it doesn't care for you. Burn. Signed, Lieutenant Holt." And they had each gone through a bunch of emotional trauma at this point, but they still hadn't found the key. There was another room, and there was a distinct feature that they had found out about their guide, that whenever they asked Thrax questions, he couldn't seem to pull anything from his past. He couldn't seem to remember, and they didn't know whether it was some kind of trauma that he had experienced. And during one of their gatherings at night, Lieutenant Marshall had pulled everyone away from Thrax and explained that Lieutenant Holt, in his ever quest for obedience for his troop, had tortured Thrax. Thrax, being the most unobedient and slacking of all his troops, Holt had tried to break him. And they flashing back to Lieutenant Xena's room, this last room that seemed to be made for Thrax, with his name carved on the wall. They thought that maybe they'll get a glimpse of what Thrax's past was. And as he opened the door, it was nothing more than an empty room. The only thing in the room was a note with a key attached to it. A pink key. The key of Lieutenant Xena. And on the note it said, "Discipline is the soul of the army. It makes small numbers formidable, procures success to the weak, and esteem to all. And that is precisely what you lack. You must learn obedience. You don't care for Silverpine, and it doesn't care for you. Signed, Lieutenant Holt." And you saw Thrax break down in tears now, as even he was hoping that maybe he would learn something of his past, because he can't pull anything from it. But they continued on and rested for the night. And the next morning they were aiming to conquer the next two rooms, only two rooms remaining. It was Commander Shoa's room and Lieutenant Holt's room. And as they went through Shoa's room, they were met with no resistance or notes of any sort. And they found after going through some of the training rooms and where some of the bunks where the men were held that were under Showa's command, they found a small room that had a stone table in it with 8 chairs. Lieutenant Marshall by this time was fully recuperated and was traveling with them through each of these rooms now. The party saw Lieutenant Marshall go up to his table and run his hands across it and tell them that this is where the lieutenants and the commander met before the accident happened with the Dark Pillar. And through some questioning, they were able to figure out that Lieutenant Harold was killed in the incident that happened with him. They found out a little bit more details with him. They traveled on to Showa's private quarters. And they found a voucher in an envelope that read, "Mission status. Division led by Sergeant Titus to escort the VIP to her destination. The carriage will be traveling by night out of the kingdom. She will not return until unrest is solved. Location unknown to even the lieutenants. And when they asked Lieutenant Marshall about this, he was confused as he never received that mission voucher. It must have been something above him. But he did recognize Sergeant Titus's name. Sergeant Titus had worked under Showa for a while now and was a very loyal and faithful soldier. And the date marked on the mission voucher was about 2.5 weeks. Same time, about a half a week before the fall of Silverpine. That was all that was on Showa's desk besides his key, so they grabbed the key and they continued on, and now it was just one more room. And they had grown quite powerful in their resolve to see this through and learn quite a lot about each other and grown emotionally as a team. They had molded together and were beginning to learn how to back up each other's weaknesses and strengthen each other. They had gained many magical items from this point on and from the different rooms, and they believed that they were ready to face their biggest challenge yet. Because what they all believed to be in that last room was Lieutenant Holt himself and the other 2 lieutenants. But more than that, there was the emotional trauma that Thrax was going to have to go through, seeing his old stomping grounds in this area. And they would travel through this room of Lieutenant Holt, and they would see torture devices, waterboarding, chains, items that were meant to break the soldier's mentality so that Lieutenant Holt could reform it to whatever he wanted it to be. Thrax was near the verge of tears and anger. And right before the final room, Remorse had been, during her visions, getting more and more definite in her questions, precise, and was able to get an answer out of Eden. That Eden was her father, who she never knew. But more than that, she was able to talk with Sorrow and in private be able to say that Eden had also told Sorrow that he was her father as well. So that could only mean one thing, that they were sisters. They were family. Sorrow was joyful and happy that she finally had someone to cling to, especially someone to cling to in this time of need of having to go through all of this. Sorrow no longer knew what she wanted at this point, having to go through all of Moongrave Pass. It meant more strife for Remorse, though, because she knew what it meant to have Sorrow as family, and there were still secrets that Remorse was holding on to with her story. Secrets that, after seeing Sorrow's room, she didn't know if she would be able to tell her. The party would then continue to the final room of Moongrave Pass, Lieutenant Holt's inner chambers, and as they entered, it reminded them of a courtroom set up with a pulpit and benches and 2 stands. And there stood Lieutenant Holt, beaming with power as it crackled off his saber. And behind him were standing 2 lieutenants, Lieutenant Xena and Lieutenant Terra, and a deadly battle started. And during the heat of this battle, JoDargo would be overcome with some kind of corruption that they think would originated from his first curse when he first touched the key, and he would be taken over and he would be fighting the party as well. But they did have Lieutenant Marshall and Private Thrax, who fought with animal-like instincts as they swung away at Lieutenant Holt. The rest of the party was able to deal with the other 2 lieutenants and kill them. And finally, after hours of battle, Lieutenant Holt fell. Not dead, but unable to move, with his back hanging against the wall. And in his final moments, as Thrax approached to end his life, Lieutenant Holt started speaking. Honestly, and not in riddles. He asked for forgiveness from Thrax. He's asked for something that he would never be able to give back to Thrax. He apologized for everything and explained that he just wanted to see his friend again, and his friend Harold. He missed him, and he didn't understand why no one else wanted to know the truth. And looking back, he regrets the better part of his life as a lieutenant. But he kind of reverted back to his training under Horus. When he was so young, Horus bestowed a sense of obedience upon him that the mission was the most critical thing to him. It hadn't become evident to Lieutenant Holt how much Horus had broken him from a young age until after Harold had passed. Because Harold was always his beacon. And as the party listened to the final moments of Holt, Thrax would lean down, and they would not be able to hear the words, but they were able to see Thrax's mouth move and be able to guess the words that Thrax said to Lieutenant Holt. It was 3 words. I forgive you. And just as Thrax said that to Lieutenant Holt, he would shove a dagger through his heart and instantly killing him. A single tear coming down Thrax's cheek as, yes, he had avenged his torturer, but he still hadn't unlocked what was a mist, a fog in his brain. And Lieutenant Marshall called upon the 2 privates who were still guarding the front gate and told them to prepare for a burial, 3 burials. And the party was kind of shocked to hear this, but Lieutenant Marshall explained to them that these 3 lieutenants had given their lives to Silverpine, even though, yes, they ended it corrupted and in the thralls of Thoristan. They did give the better part of their life serving Silverpine and protecting it, and they did so with a loyalty unknown until the very end. The 2 privates quickly prepare for a burial of the 3 lieutenants, and as that is happening, they will be swinging open the front gates of Moongrave Pass. Marshall will be looking up into the sky as they hear a crashing and a loud explosion. And coming back from where they came from, they saw a huge spectral golden short sword in the sky swinging down onto something. Lieutenant Marshall having no time to explain, would run back to the party and hug Sorrow and explain that, well, not explain, but say that they needed his help, and he would furiously run off into the forest back through Moongrave Pass, and the two privates would close the door behind him. The party had no other choice but to continue forward. They had grown very strong in their power and their bonds, and there was much to discuss now that some secrets had come out. But first they must open this door that they've been trying to open for so long. And as they take the final key, the crimson key of Lieutenant Holt, and they open the door, the main gates swing open and they walk into this beautiful open, ornate room. And all these different kaleidoscope colors fall onto the tiled ground as they see stained glass windows to their left and right. And they finally feel the sun on their skin for the first time in what seems to be ages, as these passages of windows were carved into the mountain so the sun could reach this room, and they had filled it with different stained glass so it makes all these beautiful, beautiful patterns on the ground. And it is here that there is some hope among the party that they'll be able to accomplish this mission that they have sought off for. Each of them has been shaken in their morals and to their core from what has happened to them so far, and they fear that every step that they take towards the university is going to be one step harder than the last, as they still don't know how to deal with Scar, and his disappearance has made them uneasy. But right here, there is time to rest in this room, even if it's for a few minutes, and talk and trying to explain what they just witnessed. And that is where our story ends for right now. That is the story in its entirety until we pick back off. Pick back up next week with our first player involved session. This was just the prologue to the Dark Pillar. Next week we're actually going to have a real D&D session instead of just this prologue. And with that, I hope everyone has a great night. Bye bye for now.